Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're going to tackle a word you probably hear all the time, ecosystem. And what we're going to find is pretty amazing. How a huge forest, or even just a single drop of water, can be a whole world unto itself.
All right, so here's the game plan. We'll kick things off with a simple definition. Then we'll break down the living and non-living parts. After that, we'll look at how it all gets organized. And to wrap it up, we'll see how this all plays out in a simple pond.
Okay, so first things first. We throw this word ecosystem around constantly, right? But what is it, really? What are we actually talking about?
Well, the most important part of that definition is the phrase functional unit. See, it's not just a random collection of stuff in a place. It's a living, breathing system where all the organisms are constantly interacting with each other and with the physical world around them. So, to get a handle on this, we can basically split ecosystems into two big buckets. You've got your land-based ones, we call those terrestrial, so think forests, grasslands, deserts. And then you have the water-based ones, the aquatic systems, like ponds, lakes, and rivers. And here's where it gets really cool, the scale. An ecosystem can be something as small and contained as an aquarium you have at home, or as huge as a sprawling forest. In fact, you could argue that our entire planet, the whole biosphere, is actually one giant interconnected ecosystem. All right, so what are the building blocks? What's actually in one of these systems? Well, it turns out, no matter how big or small, they're all made from the same two basic types of ingredients.
Okay, so on one side, you've got the non-living stuff, the abiotic factors. This is basically the stage, the water, the soil, the amount of sunlight, the temperature. And on the other side, you've got the living things, the biotic organisms. These are the actors on the stage, the producers, consumers, and decomposers.
Now, these parts aren't just hanging out together. They're actually working, doing four essential jobs that keep the whole show running. You can almost think of it like nature's business model.
Okay, so here are the four big jobs. First, you've got productivity. That's basically making the food and energy. Then you need energy flow, because that energy has to get passed around. Number 3 is decomposition, the cleanup crew that breaks down all the dead stuff. And finally, that leads to nutrient cycling, which is all about recycling the raw materials so the whole process can start over.
So where does all this energy come from in the first place? Well, for pretty much every ecosystem on Earth, it all starts with the sun. And the way that sunlight gets into the system is through plants. But get this is pretty wild. Of all the solar radiation that's actually useful, plants only manage to capture a tiny slice of it. We're talking just 2 to 10%. Just let that sink in. That little sliver of captured sunlight is what powers almost the entire living world. And this is a really important rule to remember. Energy flow is a one-way street. It doesn't circle back around. It flows in a straight line, from the sun to the producers like plants, and then onto the consumers who eat them. That's it.
Okay, so we've got the parts, and we've got the jobs they do, but there's also a physical structure to these things, a kind of organization to how all the living creatures are arranged.
The first piece of that structure is what we call species composition. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's the who's who of the ecosystem. It's just a head count and a list of all the different plants and animals living there. And the second piece is something called stratification. This is super interesting. It just means that life isn't all jumbled together on one level. It's organized vertically, in layers. Think of it like different floors in an apartment building, from the penthouse down to the basement.
A forest is the perfect way to picture this. Way up top, you have the trees making up the canopy. That's the top floor. Below that, you've got a layer of shrubs. And then down at the very bottom, on the forest floor, you find the herbs and grasses. Each layer is its own little world.
All right, let's put all this theory into practice. We're going to zoom right in on a classic, simple ecosystem that you can probably find nearby, a pond. Let's see how all these ideas we've talked about actually work. First up, you've got the abiotic foundation. Remember, that's the non-living stuff. So for a pond, that's the water itself, all the dissolved minerals in it, the rich mud and soil at the bottom, and of course, things like sunlight, temperature, and even how long the days are. Okay, now let's add the living creatures, the biotic community. You've got your producers, right? So that's things like phytoplankton and algae soaking up the sun. Then you have your consumers, the zooplankton and little insects that swim around munching on that algae. And finally, at the bottom, you have the decomposers, the fungi and bacteria, the cleanup crew, just waiting for things to die so they can break them down. And right here, in this little pond, you can see those 4 jobs happening in real time. Job 1, productivity. The algae converts sunlight into food. Job 2, energy flow. The zooplankton eats the algae. Job 3, decomposition. When anything dies and sinks, the bacteria break it down. And that leads right into Job 4, nutrient cycling. That breakdown releases nutrients back into the water, which the algae can then use to grow. It's a perfect loop. So what you're looking at is a perfect, self-sustaining world in miniature. This little pond is doing everything our entire planet's biosphere does. It's producing energy, moving it around, cleaning up waste, and recycling nutrients. It's a complete microcosm. Which kind of leaves you with a final thought, doesn't it? If a single ordinary pond can be such a complete and complex little world, it really makes you wonder how many other tiny worlds are out there all around us that we just walk past every single day without even noticing.
All right, today we're going to get right into the heart of how life on our planet actually, well, works. We're talking about ecosystems and the absolutely fundamental cycle that lets them keep going for thousands of years, the constant creation and recycling of life itself.
I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. You have a huge forest, right? It's packed with millions of living things, and it just thrives for centuries. There are no trucks bringing in food or fertilizer, so how in the world does it pull that off? Where does all the energy, all the raw material to build new life even come from?
Well, the answer is actually kind of beautiful in its simplicity. Every single self-sustaining ecosystem, whether it's a tiny little pond or the entire planet, runs on these 2 core jobs, working in perfect sync. You have to be able to produce new life, and then you have to be able to recycle the old. That's it. That's the secret.
Okay, so let's tackle that first piece of the puzzle, making the stuff of life. This is all about what scientists call primary productivity, and you really can't overstate this. It is the absolute foundation for pretty much every food chain on Earth.
So, what is it, really? Simply put, primary production is just the creation of new organic stuff. Leaves, wood, roots, all of it, by plants using the power of sunlight. They're literally turning air, water, and light into solid, living material. This is square one for almost all the energy in any ecosystem.
Now, here's a really important little detail that trips a lot of people up. We often use the words production and productivity like they're the same thing, but they're not. Production is the total amount of stuff that's been made, like all the trees in this patch of forest weigh X tons. But productivity, that's the rate. How fast is new stuff being made? That's what really tells you how alive and kicking an ecosystem is. It's all about the speed.
To get a little more specific, we start with something called gross primary productivity, or GPP. The easiest way to think about this is like an ecosystem's gross salary. It's the grand total, every single bit of energy that the plants capture from the sun and turn into matter, before any of it gets used.
But, just like us, plants have expenses. They can't just bank that whole paycheck. They need to burn some of that energy just to stay alive, for things like breathing and growing. That cost of living is called respiration. And that's the R in this simple little formula. So the total income, GPP, has to cover those living expenses first.
So what's left over after the plants pay their own energy bills? That is the net primary productivity, or NPP. This is the ecosystem's take-home pay, and this is the number that really matters for everyone else. The NPP is the actual usable energy in biomass that's now available for the herbivores to eat, and eventually for the decomposers to break down. This is the stuff that fuels the rest of the entire food web.
Which brings us perfectly to the second half of this incredible cycle. So we've built all this life using that take-home pay, the NPP, but what happens when it eventually dies? Well, that's when the cleanup crew shows up, the unbelievably important decomposers who handle all the recycling.
You've probably heard this before, right? The whole idea that the earthworm is the farmer's friend. And it's true. They help break things down and make the soil better. It's a perfect, everyday example of this massive, vital process at work.
And the raw material for this whole recycling operation has a name: detritus. It's just the scientific word for all the dead organic stuff lying around. We're talking fallen leaves, dead logs, animal remains, even waste like fecal matter. Basically, it's this huge pile of resources just waiting to be taken apart and reused. And that process of taking it apart, it doesn't just happen randomly. Oh no, it's actually a super organized, multi-stage process.
Think of it like a factory's disassembly line, but in reverse, with different specialists handling each and every step of the breakdown. So here's how that disassembly line works. First up, fragmentation. Critters like earthworms, they act like shredders, breaking the big pieces of detritus into smaller bits. Next, you get leaching. This is where water just washes out some of the easily dissolved nutrients right into the soil. Then comes the real heavy lifting, catabolism. Bacteria and fungi release these powerful enzymes that chemically break down the material even further. That process leads to humification, which creates this dark, rich, stable stuff called humus. And then finally, mineralization. The humus itself gets broken down, releasing simple inorganic nutrients right back into the soil, making them perfectly available for plants to suck up and start this whole cycle all over again.
So we've got our two processes, making life and recycling it. Now let's just zoom out for a second and look at the sheer mind-boggling scale of this cycle and what's controlling it across the entire planet.
Get ready for this number. The planet's annual take-home pay, that net primary productivity we talked about, it's a staggering 170 billion tons of organic matter. That is the weight of all the new plant life created on Earth in one single year. It's just incredible.
And here's where that production happens, which is pretty surprising. You'd probably guess the oceans, right? I mean, they cover over 70% of the planet. But check this out. Ecosystems on land are actually responsible for about 2/3 of all the world's net primary productivity. It turns out a lot of the ocean is kind of like a nutrient desert.
So what controls how fast this whole cycle runs? Think of them as control knobs for the ecosystem. For productivity, for making new stuff, the big knobs are things like sunlight, temperature, and, of course, nutrient availability. For decomposition, the recycling part, the speed is controlled by oxygen, temperature, moisture, and what the dead stuff is actually made of. But here's the absolute key takeaway. These two sets of knobs are directly wired together. The speed of decomposition, how fast those nutrients get recycled, directly controls one of the most important knobs for productivity, nutrient availability. So in other words, the recycling department basically sets the budget and the pace for the entire operation. Slow recycling means slow growth. Period.
And all of this brings us to the central question, the one that really unlocks this whole concept. If decomposition is all about breakdown, about the end of an organism's story, how on earth can it also be the beginning of a new one?
Well, because as we've just seen, it's not an end at all. Not really. Decomposition is the engine of renewal. It takes all the complex, locked-up materials from things that have died, and it meticulously breaks them back down into their simplest forms, making those building blocks available again. Production creates, decomposition renews. They're two halves of one single, continuous, and absolutely essential cycle of life.
You know, every single living thing on this planet, from a tiny bacterium to the biggest whale in the ocean, needs energy to survive. But have you ever really stopped to think about where that energy comes from? Today, we're going to follow that trail of energy all the way back to its source and uncover some of the most fundamental rules that govern all of life. So, it all kicks off with the sun, right? It's this giant fusion reactor in the sky, just blasting our planet with an incredible amount of energy. But wait a minute. If that's true, why isn't the Earth just completely covered, wall to wall, with life? Where does all that power actually go? Well, that's the big mystery we're going to unravel. Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at the ultimate energy source. Then we'll meet the key players who capture and pass that energy around. We'll check out the two main roads that energy can travel, learn how to climb what's called the trophic ladder, and finally, we'll expose the universal tax that limits every single food chain on Earth.
So, let's start at the very beginning. Our star. For pretty much every ecosystem on Earth, with a few weird exceptions like deep sea vents, the sun is the one and only power source.
Now, here's something that might surprise you. You'd think plants can use all the sunlight that hits them, right? Well, nope. More than half of the radiation that reaches us is the wrong wavelength for photosynthesis. Less than half of it is what scientists call photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR. That's the only part of the light spectrum that life can actually use to make food. And here's the real kicker. Of that already small amount of usable light, plants only manage to capture and convert a tiny, tiny fraction of it, somewhere between just 2 and 10%. I mean, let that sink in. This sliver of energy is what has to power the entire living world. It's kind of amazing, really.
So, what happens to that tiny little fraction of energy?
Well, to figure that out, we need to meet the players in this energy game. And really, it all boils down to two main roles: those who make the energy and those who, well, take it. First up, we've got the real heroes of this story, the producers. You might have also heard them called autotrophs. These guys are the absolute foundation, the master chefs of every ecosystem. They're the only living things that can take raw energy from the sun and turn it into food. And, these producers aren't a one-size-fits-all deal. They look totally different depending on where they live. Here on land, we're talking about all the plants we see every day: trees, grass, flowers. But in the water, the real heavy lifting is done by microscopic phytoplankton and algae. Okay, so if you're not a producer, what are you? Well, you're in this camp, the consumers, also called heterotrophs. Basically, this is everybody else. From a tiny insect to a huge bear, if an organism can't make its own food from sunlight, it has to get its energy by eating other things. And this is where things get interesting, because there's a definite pecking order. You have your primary consumers, the herbivores, who eat the plants. Then they get eaten by secondary consumers, who are carnivores. And then those guys might get eaten by an even bigger predator, the tertiary consumers. It's like a ladder, with energy moving up one step at a time. All right, so once a plant has locked down that solar energy, that energy is at a crossroads. It can head down one of two very different paths through the ecosystem. The first path is the one we all know from nature documentaries, the grazing food chain. It starts with a living plant getting eaten by an animal. Simple enough. And in the ocean, this is the main event. But here on land, believe it or not, that's not the main story. A much, much bigger chunk of energy flows through a second, hidden path, the detritus food chain. This one starts with dead stuff, fallen leaves, dead animals, and the whole world of decomposers that feast on it. But let's be real, nature is never that clean and tidy, right? These separate chains are really just a convenient idea. In the real world, they're all tangled together. You've got animals like bears or us humans, omnivores, who eat both plants and other animals, linking everything together into what's really a complex and messy food web. So, to try and make sense of this beautifully messy web, ecologists came up with a system. It's a way to classify any organism based purely on where it gets its energy. It's not about the species, it's about the job. And that system is all about something called a trophic level. Don't let the fancy name fool you. It's basically just an organism's job description in the energy economy. It's defined by one thing and one thing only: what it eats. Each level is one step up the energy ladder. So let's map this out. At the very bottom, the first trophic level, you've got the producers, the energy makers. The herbivores that eat them, they're on the second trophic level. Carnivores that eat those herbivores are on the third. And any top predators that eat those carnivores, well, they're sitting up on the fourth trophic level. It's a structured flow, moving energy from the ground up. All right, now we're getting to the absolute heart of the matter. This is the single biggest rule in the entire game of life, the one thing that shapes every ecosystem on the planet. It's a universal law of inefficiency. And it all boils down to one number. Just one: 10%. Remember this number because it explains so much. This is the famous 10% law. And what it means is that for every step you take up the food chain, a whopping 90% of the energy just vanishes. It's lost, mostly as heat, as the organism goes about its day. It's like there's an inescapable cosmic energy tax of 90% at every single level. And this chart right here shows you exactly what that looks like. It's pretty dramatic, right? If the producers at the bottom start with, say, 10,000 units of energy, the herbivores that eat them only get about 1,000 of those units to build their own bodies. The next level up? Just 100. This is why the pyramid of life has to have a massive base and gets tiny at the top real fast. So what's the big takeaway from this massive energy loss? Well, it has a huge, and I mean huge, consequence that you can see everywhere you look. It puts a very strict limit on how long a food chain can be. It's simple math, really. When you're losing 90% of your fuel at every single stop, you're not going to get very far. After just 3 or 4 steps up the ladder, there's just not enough energy left to support another level. This is exactly why most food chains top out at 4, maybe 5 levels max. The energy just runs out. But of course, nature loves to throw us a curveball, right? Here's the final little layer of complexity. Remember, a trophic level is a job, not a species. Think about a sparrow. When that sparrow eats seeds, it's acting as a primary consumer, level 2.
But if that same sparrow eats a grasshopper, bam, it's suddenly a secondary consumer on level 3. The same animal can have multiple jobs in the energy web. And that, of course, brings the question right back to us. What about you? Think about what you ate today. If you had a salad, you were a primary consumer. If you had a burger, you were a secondary consumer. If you ate a fish that ate smaller fish, well, you see where this is going. So take a second. How many different trophic levels do you occupy?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really powerful tool that ecologists use to basically understand the structure of life itself. We're talking about the ecological pyramid, which is like a blueprint for an entire ecosystem. So how can you possibly visualize an entire ecosystem in just one shape? Well, it all starts with something I'm sure you're familiar with, the food chain. You know, that simple idea of who eats who. It's the absolute foundation, the first building block for seeing the bigger picture.
All right, so we're going from a simple chain to this big pyramid shape. How do we do that? Well, we take that basic who eats who line and we start stacking it. And that's when the hidden rules of the ecosystem really start to pop out.
Okay, let's take a super simple example. You've got grass, a goat eats the grass, and then a person eats the goat. Easy enough, right? So first, we give everyone a job title, what we call a trophic level. The grass is the producer, the goat is the primary consumer, and the person is the secondary consumer. Then you just stack them up. And just by doing that, you get this pyramid shape. And you'll notice the producers, the grass in this case, always make up that big, sturdy base.
And that shape, that's what we call an ecological pyramid. Now, it's a model, right? It's a way for us to compare different ecosystems by looking at 3 totally different things. First, just the raw number of organisms. Second, their total weight or mass. And third, how energy flows between them.
First up, the pyramid of number. This is where we're literally just counting heads. And believe it or not, this simple count can show us some pretty weird and surprising things.
Most of the time, it's pretty much what you'd expect. Think about a grassland. You've got millions and millions of blades of grass. Those support, I don't know, thousands of herbivores, grasshoppers maybe. And those, in turn, can only support a handful of top predators, like hawks. See, you get that classic upright pyramid shape. Lots at the bottom, very few at the top.
But, and this is where it gets cool, what happens when that neat pattern just completely falls apart? Like, what if your entire ecosystem is based on just one single producer? Imagine a single giant tree. Okay, so you have one big tree. That's one producer. But that single tree can support thousands of insects that are feeding on it. And those thousands of insects might support hundreds of little birds. All of a sudden, your pyramid is completely flipped upside down. It's inverted. One thing at the bottom and thousands above it.
So you can see how just counting individuals can sometimes be, well, a little misleading. So what if we try something else? Instead of counting them, let's weigh them. This brings us to the pyramid of biomass.
So what this pyramid does is it measures the total standing crop. That's just a fancy term for the mass of all the living stuff at each level at any given moment. And pro tip, ecologists usually use dry weight. Why? Because it's way more accurate when you're just trying to measure the actual biological material, not all the water.
And guess what? We run into another fascinating paradox here, but this time we're in the ocean. How on earth can a tiny mass of organisms support a much larger mass of fish? It just doesn't seem to make sense, does it?
So get this, the total weight of all the fish and the little zooplankton they eat can actually be way greater than the weight of the microscopic phytoplankton they're feeding on. So how is that even possible? Well, it comes down to speed. Those phytoplankton reproduce like crazy. So even though their standing crop, the amount of them at any one time, is small, they're constantly replenishing themselves so fast that their overall productivity is massive. And boom, you get another inverted pyramid.
Okay, so we've seen that pyramids of number and biomass can get flipped on their head. They can be inverted. So it makes you wonder, is there any rule that always holds true? And the answer is yes. There is one unbreakable rule, and it all comes down to energy.
And here's the absolute key to everything. The transfer of energy from one level to the next is super inefficient. I mean, wildly inefficient. Every single time something gets eaten, the laws of thermodynamics just kick in and a huge amount of that energy is lost as heat. It just radiates away. And it's that basic law of physics that gives the energy pyramid its unbreakable, always upright shape.
There's actually a pretty good rule of thumb for this. We call it the 10% rule. It's really simple, but it's also incredibly powerful. It's the reason you don't see ecosystems with, like, 20 different levels of predators.
Let's just look at the numbers, because it makes it so clear. Imagine the producers at the bottom have, say, 10,000 joules of energy. Well, the primary consumers who eat them, they only get about 10% of that, just 1,000 joules. And the secondary consumers who eat them, they're left with just 100 joules. See that massive drop-off at each step? That's it. That's why the pyramid of energy is always wide at the bottom and gets real skinny real fast at the top.
Now, don't get me wrong, the pyramid is a fantastic model. It really helps us grasp these core ideas. But we have to remember that nature is a lot messier than a simple, neat triangle, you know?
So what are the cracks in this model? Well, for starters, it assumes a simple food chain, but in reality, it's a tangled-up food web. And a lot of animals don't fit neatly into one box. What about a sparrow that eats seeds and insects? Is it a primary or a secondary consumer? It's both. And maybe the biggest oversight is that these pyramids have no room for the decomposers, the fungi, the bacteria, the essential cleanup crew that recycles everything back into the system.
All right, so we've established that energy is on a one-way street through an ecosystem. It comes in and then it's lost. But what about the actual matter? The atoms and molecules that everything is built from? Well, unlike energy, that stuff doesn't just vanish. It gets used again and again.
And that's really the fundamental difference you have to grasp. Energy flows. It makes a one-way trip from the sun through the ecosystem and out as heat. But nutrients, they cycle. They're the building blocks of life, and they get used over and over and over again in this incredible continuous loop.
And these nutrient cycles come in a couple of main flavors. You've got your gaseous cycles like carbon, where the main reservoir is in the atmosphere or the oceans. And then you have sedimentary cycles like phosphorus, which is mostly locked up in the Earth's crust, in rocks and soil. And of course, life depends on both of these running smoothly.
So here's a little something to think about next time you sit down for a meal. Look at your plate. How many trophic levels are you occupying right now? Are you a primary consumer, eating those plants, or a secondary consumer, eating an animal that ate plants? Maybe you're a little bit of both. Just thinking about where your food's energy came from, it tells us an amazing story about your own place in the pyramid, and really about the fundamental structure of life on our planet.